Okay. This is the really easy bit, this panel. All we've got to do is answer the question, what does this mean? Simple. So we have three panellists who have already spoken to you, and I won't bother giving full introductions for them, but Jason Baker of Ibis World, Jason Pomeroy, get the two Jasons side by side here, eco-architect and Pomeroy Studios in Singapore, or Studio in Singapore. Hugh McKay, we've just heard from, but we're also joined by Professor Komla Tsey, tropical leader and research professor in education for social sustainability within the school and the Cairns Institute. Highly qualified research professor with more than 25 years' experience, who provides leadership as part of transdisciplinary teams across the School of Education, the Cairns Institute and beyond, to undertake developmental research in the field of education for social sustainability. Komla was head of the Central Australian unit, the Menzies School of Health Research, and contributed significantly towards the setting up of Cooperative Research Centre for Aboriginal Health, which is now the Lowacha Institute, and was one of the CRC's 5 inaugural research program leaders. Would you give a particular welcome to Komla Tsey? I'll remind you again, have in mind as we're progressing that you will have an opportunity to ask questions. You can use Twitter if you want, hashtag FTEC, but if you are going to use Twitter to pose your question rather than ask it direct, you will have to, of course, fit it inside the tight characters of Twitter. Now I'm going to start by putting a nice big fat broad question to you all, and it goes back to where we started really, and is life, and it goes back to the State of the Tropics report, because as I said earlier this morning, there was lots of good news in there in terms of advances post-war across, broadly speaking, the tropical economies, but almost every one of those advances was followed by a but. Is life in the tropics getting better? Hugh.
I think life in the tropics has unambiguously improved over a substantial period of time. The real analytical problem is to disentangle how much of that is actually associated with a period in history where commodity prices were very strong, and the tropical zone is more linked into the primary sector than the temperate zones. And therefore, we can't ignore the fact that there has been a transfer of income from resource-poor jurisdictions to resource-rich jurisdictions, which is actually a transfer from the temperate to the tropical. And so the terms of trade can cover up a lot of things for a long period of time, and I think Australia is a prime example of this. But if you look to Brazil or you look to growth in tropical Africa, which has been quite strong for a long period of time, a great deal of that does come back to a shift in commodity prices. In zones where it's not about resource intensity, and you can look to a place like Singapore, there has been a very, very pronounced uplift in living standard, which you can bring back to the classical drivers of economic growth. On the back of that, though, it's the countries that are actually on the cusp, or straddle economies, as the State of the Tropics calls them, which have actually done the best over the last little while. That's China, that's India, and that is where we've seen the most pronounced uplift out of poverty. And I think there's a lot to be learnt, particularly from the leveraging of comparative advantage we've seen in both of those jurisdictions, and the tropics needs to have a mixed economic model which takes advantage of the very, very specific biosphere in which their economies conduct themselves. They can't forget the fact that there are some very simple fundamental building blocks that take you from low income to middle income. East Asia's unlocked that. Few others have recently. And the institutional backdrop that supports that we do well to try and transplant that to other regions.
Okay. Jason, and I'm going from, I suppose, the big picture with you two to more the micro. So, Jason?
The answer is obviously yes, but, and that's been said throughout, most of the tropical economies were coming off quite a low base compared to the rest of the world, and therefore they do need to catch up and still have a long way to go to catch up.
And in that sense, you've got to be careful at how you read the picture, haven't you?
Yeah, that's
right. You can see something that appears to have developed enormously, but if it's off a very low base, that's not quite the same as...
Well, GDP per capita in the tropics is only half of that of the world overall. So you've got $13,000 GDP per capita in the world overall and 6.5 in the tropics. And in many parts of the tropics, it's even less than that as well. So you've got some developed countries like Australia and Singapore that are doing just fine, thanks. But the growth rates in Africa in particular have been... The overall standard of living in much of Africa tropical Africa, is far below the tropics, the rest of the world as a whole. So I think there's a lot of room still to go. And I think there's a lot of areas for improvement in things like governance in particular, getting rid of corruption and things like that, further investment in education and infrastructure that tropical economies need to focus on to enable them to continue to catch up to the standards of living that the rest of the world has.
Corruption's an interesting one, isn't it? Because once it actually becomes institutionalised in a country, God knows how you eradicate it or bring it back into some kind of reasonable control.
Yeah, I mean, one of the things that's interesting is, I guess, when countries start to get a decent standard of living and start to become a middle-income country, the citizens of the middle class that become quite powerful start to wake up and say, hey, these sorts of things are unacceptable. And I think as we've seen throughout countries like Taiwan and South Korea might be examples of countries that used to have a lot more corruption in government when they were lower income countries, but now their citizens have demanded more openness and things like that, and now that they've progressed through, corruption is less of an issue. And so perhaps that can be the case for the lower ranking tropical nations like the Philippines and Indonesia, for example, in our near region.
Komla. Sorry.
In thinking about whether life is improving in the tropics, I'd just like to use the opportunity to say a few things about some of the areas I've been looking at. You know, when we meet at conferences like this, we talk about economic development, we talk about development. But for ordinary people at village levels, at community levels, what does development actually mean to them? I have been in a privileged position to be living in Australia, asking similar questions at community levels, indigenous communities here, but also being able to maintain longitudinal studies with my own native Ghana, where I come from. Every 2 years, I go back to rural villages. Just asking the basic questions in terms of trying to find out about people's aspirations. How are people trying to improve conditions for themselves? What are their priorities? What are the challenges? What are the opportunities? What is working? What is not working? And so this is part of where I'm coming from. Just listening to the conversations yesterday, I think a number of comments in terms of thinking about whether life is improving in the tropics or not. We need to take history. History is so important. We need to take history seriously. And I like Hughes looking ahead 100 years from now. I like to look back 100 years before where we are now. You see, I should have brought the book. I came out with a book last year, which really tried to explore the origins of this notion of tropical development. At the end of the 19th century, there were conversations like this in European capitals, in London, other places. I mean, some politicians saw the tropical world as one large estate awaiting systematic development. I guess the point I'm trying to make is unless we understand the history, when you look at the tropical countries, only Ethiopia and Thailand are the two exceptions that did not have a history of colonization. I'm not raising the issue of colonization as something we should get stuck with, but I'm trying to say that unless we understand the colonial configurations of what we are calling countries today, it's going to be hard to understand the sort of policies, the sort of community engagement, education programs we can implement to ensure peace and security, which forms the basis of economic development. Yes, so I know I'm not answering the questions directly, but I just think there's a lot of historical background that we need to really engage with to be able to make sense of as to whether life is improving or not.
So when you hear at a conference like this, or you hear, I mean, it's somewhat pervasive, is the sort of the broad lip service to all of these factors being integrated, that when it comes down to a government to develop, that it does look to seriously integrate, take into account issues like sustainability, human capital and so on. What some people might call the soft issues. How much faith do you have in governments, including democratic governments, that they will move beyond the lip service on past record and actually take proper account of those issues, including human capital, including the people you are talking about at village level or its equivalent?
Look, I have a lot of faith in leadership. And for me, government ought to be about leadership. If there's leadership and understanding of history of what needs to be done. Just to cite an example, in my own country, Ghana, at the time of independence, over a 100-year colonial period, no British firm working in Ghana paid profit or income tax. All income tax was paid in the UK. There were forward-looking governors over the time who consistently telling the British Treasury that, look, this is the once-in-a-lifetime opportunity. A colony like Ghana, over a 20-year period, was producing so much cocoa to feed, the chocolate factories of the West, that we need to tax these companies and use that for social investment. Consistently, the British Treasury ignored. At the same time, in fact, they even used Australia, Canada as the white settler examples, that companies in these countries were allowed to share their income tax with the British government. And by the time independence came, most of these colonies had no taxation basis at all. And so the question of how to embark on social development, just to cut a long story short, in the case of Ghana, as well as the way colonial systems brought together the confederation of different ethnic groups, the whole processes of divide and rule. By the time of independence, there were 3 university graduates in 1/3 of the country, whereas in my own village alone, there were more than 3 university graduates. Now, what did leadership, the first independent government, what did they do? They came up with the first positive discrimination policy, even long before the civil rights movement in America. So fee-free education came to this 1/3 of the northern part of the country, and anybody from the southern 2/3 were made to pay school fees. Over a generation or two, things leveled up. In Nigeria, what we are seeing today about Boko Haram and others, the same way Nigeria, a third of the country was kept backward for economic reasons at the time. Unlike Ghana, which pursued positive discrimination, politicians rather fed on those divisions for their own gains. Hence the civil war and what we are seeing today. So I guess what I'm trying to say is leadership. I think leadership is critical, and with the correct leadership, some of these problems can be addressed.
Yes, well, there's a simple solution. We just need good leaders. Okay. Now, Jason Pomeroy, we had quite a dynamic sort of micro view from you yesterday, and I want to expand on some of that this morning. But broadly speaking, is life in the tropics getting better?
I think that's something that is quite tangible and something that you can all see. If you're going to Singapore, Kuala Lumpur, Jakarta, Manila, we are seeing relics of a colonial past in the shop houses, the go-downs to Boat Quay or Clark Quay, Intramuros in Manila with these wonderful Spanish structures. What we can see is that these were cities that were born out of trade and commerce, whether it's the Dutch East India Company or the British East India Company, and we saw that gradual growth. We see sanitization, we can see wonderful structures that were actually allowing those tropical economies to grow. What I find fascinating is that these colonists disappeared only to be then recolonized by international banking, accountancy and legal institutions, putting up glass high-rises and blocks that looked like they could have come out of a magazine in Chicago or Manhattan. It was this sign of opulence and power and prestige in these developing economies. So does it actually mean it's a better place? Environmentally, I don't think so. I think it's time for the death of the glass box. These are gas-guzzling behemoths, and we need to challenge that. I think it's important to have a cultural sustainability, which is a parameter that is often not discussed. We talk about the triple bottom line of social, economic, environmental. What about the cultural, the spatial, and the technological? What does it mean to be, from Queensland? What does it mean to be from Indonesia? What does it mean to be from Singapore when you've got a Coca-Cola culture that is purveying the world? How can we ensure that we have our own sense of self? So a cultural sustainability does actually require us to hark back to the past, learn the lessons from the past, and reinterpret for the future generations. So, again, does it make it any better? Yes, we can communicate in Wi-Fi, in cafes in Singapore, and yeah, we can actually move around with ease with the MRT system, and yes, it is a wonderful place to be living in with all that greenery. But I question the sense of community. If you're seeing that half the world's population are living in inner city centres, and it's going to increase incredibly up to 2050 in these tropical cities, what you're going to see is the local densification of particular plots. Now, if a city-state like Singapore has a plot ratio in one part of, say, 6, you can build 6 times the surface area. That would have been fine for a community in the 1960s, say. But with the pressures of urbanisation, population increase, inner city migration, you're going to need to kind of demolish and rebuild to a plot ratio of 9. What it does, it affects community. What it does, it breaks communities apart. And what it does, it puts a lot of emphasis on the developer to increase that density and actually make a lot of money. What we need to ensure is that we're still fostering the spatial sustainability. How do we preserve open spaces for culture and also for community to get together? And then the third layer, the technological sustainability, is to ensure that we're doing it sensitively. We're not just simply grabbing for these kind of renewable energies that may actually not even be specific to the climate that you're in. I find it hilarious when foreign architects come in, they stick a wind turbine on top of a building, and I can say, well, that's really great, because there is actually no wind here. So you need to be able to use...
Certainly not that high.
So you need to be able to use the technology wisely. And I think that, in summary, I do think that it is infinitely better than where we are. But that is just natural line of our own progression, our own development. But we now just need to get a bit smart.
When you, Singapore is a special case, being what it is physically and with the physical limitations on it in terms of going high-rise. China is another. You've got this sort of massive rush, that massive urbanisation where an entire city springs out of a village in the blink of an eye and suddenly there's 10 million people there. So in that context of, is it better? When you were talking yesterday about the greening of the urban high-rise, and you were showing skyscrapers that were linking pathways and green hair on top. How well do they work? Those that are up and running and have been going for a while, how well do they work as their own community?
Okay, so what we need to understand is what is public and what is private as well. So the example that I showed was linked hybrid. It's a private development. The 7 towers are interlinked by sky bridges that are actually used not only as means of circulation, so that means that one doesn't need to travel down to the ground, zip across the courtyard in the pouring rain, and then zoom up in the lift somewhere else. One can actually traverse through the site via these sky bridges. But they're also active spaces. They have auditoria, gymnasiums, breakout spaces. So they become the new social spaces in the sky. The spaces that we would normally find intrinsically on the ground have actually just been elevated. And it also provides a greater sense of connectivity. In the past, in the 20th century city of towers, just these objects placed in space, you had that sense of disconnect. You're on the 40th level, you're in your own little confines of a cell. You trundle down groundwards and you may catch up with for somebody in a coffee shop. It's then, do I want to go 40 stories down and go across? What you have with these interstitial spaces in the sky that are linked by sky bridges is alternative means of moving around and meeting people. So it's actually enhancing the quality of life.
So these are apartment blocks as well as offices and
correct. And what that means is that you're reducing the ghettoisation effect, whereby typical modern cities...
Which is what you have now in traditional...
In traditional modern cities, you may find yourself running to do your 9 o'clock to 6 o'clock job, and then the lights go out in the city for you to trundle back to your residential development, and then the lights pop up there. And so the city at night becomes a no man's land, and you just get these very, very sort of controlled periods of time of activity. In these more mixed-use environments, you're creating a 24-hour vibrancy, whereby you've got that flow between kind of living, working, playing.
So where is the village plaza? You know, if you take a kind of...
Yes.
Italy's, to me, one of the best kind of illustrations of that, where
it's
mostly the men who gather in the plaza at a certain time of day there, but you know what I mean, where people can just naturally bump into each other, can congregate, can go not just for a coffee, but
I'd like to
a genuine flow of humanity.
Indeed. I'd like to bring an example. The Campo in Siena is a wonderful medieval square that was actually... everybody thinks of public squares in Europe being truly public state, and they are. You can hold a religious rally or a political rally, and I wouldn't dare to do anything like that in Singapore. Let me just put it that way. I once took a party of...
Careful what you say, Jason.
I once took a party of students through a shopping mall, and I was already having sort of eyebrows raised. But what we find in the Campo in Siena was that there were 5 noble families that contributed collectively together to create this space for civil society to use. In many respects, these particular developers who have first mover advantage almost have that element of philanthropy to kind of say, look, we're creating these new spaces, you can actually use them. The challenge in the 21st century is to how these spaces become public, because these are still private, these are still private entities. I think the best examples will be in Tokyo and Hong Kong, whereby these spaces are then ceded over to local government.
Yes, in terms of what you were just saying, it reminded me of an interview I did with Lee Kuan Yew once when he referred to Singapore as a democracy, and I said, how is it a democracy? He said, well, we have an elected parliament.
Yeah.
And he said, with an opposition. I said, how many members are there in the opposition? He said, 1. I said, where is he? He said, he is in prison. So be careful. Yes.
Now, I think some of the points Jason makes are a very nice segue into the idea about urbanisation as a tool of development. Now, there's plenty of examples of completely failed urbanisation in the tropics. You can think about what the Brazilian government was attempting to clean up before they hosted the World Cup, for instance. Sometimes urbanisation is a sign of developmental failure. Sometimes urbanisation is an incredible elixir for growth, as we've seen in some Asian jurisdictions, and China is one of them. The next leg of growth in China might actually come from making those cities which have been a tool for income generation into nice places to live, because they certainly aren't right now. Yeah. They've lost a lot of greenery, they've replaced it with a lot of concrete, and social alienation is a problem, and they still do have a sort of a floating population of numbered somewhere between 200 and 300 million who live in shanty towns. So that's the next leg for China, is making their lives better. In countries that are not as far up the ladder as China, it's about making the urbanisation they do have more successful, and it's making sure that the urbanisation which is to come, this is probably a South Asian question and an Indonesian question, making sure that the first phase is like the Chinese, really growth and income focused, but the second phase is about livability. Countries that already have an urbanisation ratio of perhaps 80%, but as a sign of failure, where there is just a loss of job opportunities across the board, that is very, very difficult. But the only way out of that is actually education. It's making sure that people who are in depressed circumstances, at worst, their children start to get a skill level that makes them more employable, and you can make the best of a bad situation.
Anyone? Yep. Jason.
Yeah, I think both Jason and Hugh are right on the issues of urban development, but very much this is sort of these issues come into play when an economy gets larger or the standard of living gets higher. So over the past 50 years throughout the tropical region, we've seen big increases in standards of living and life expectancy. However, most of these countries are still low to middle income powers. In Singapore, for example, now GDP per capita is what, $50,000 per year. It's when you get above $20,000 per year, and you see this in Taiwan and Korea, where the people start to demand things like cleaner air. They demand public space because they've moved beyond providing for the basic necessities for themselves. So in so much of the tropics, we're back in that earlier period where people are still just trying to get into the formal economy, trying to get employment. They're only a generation away from actually living on the breadline of absolute starvation. And now, though, we're starting to see, and if you look in Manila where you've done developments now, people are demanding outside shopping malls. They're demanding clearer air. So as their wealth improves, they start to focus on more of these quality of life issues and perhaps get back to the sense of community that they once enjoyed, but only once they've gone through that initial phase of being able to feed themselves, clothe themselves, and put a roof over their head.
Yes.
Just to add quickly that when we can't think about urbanization without thinking about rural development, particularly in some, in tropical African countries I'm more familiar with, in indigenous communities in Australia, in Papua New Guinea. Things may change, but the cultural ties between people who live their villages for employment, education reasons, there are still very strong cultural ties. When you go to West Africa and you go to these rural areas, people live in their late teens to go to school, but most people, once retirement is nearing, people start making plans to return to the rural villages. In some of these rural villages, it's really people returning on retirement, highly sophisticated skills, people in their 60s, 70s, if they make it to that age without dying, they go back to these villages, huge assets to these communities. I have friends, colleagues in Australia here who tell me similar stories, indigenous people, that, look, I'm from Cape York, I live here, I enjoy reading my newspaper, drinking cappuccino on Saturday morning. I want to retire and be able to do that in Cape York. So these are, I guess we need to understand the dynamics, the cultural dynamics, and how that can bring opportunities back in these rural areas.
Well, I think the important part to take from that, Komla, is to ensure that wherever the village is or wherever the community is, that they have decent coffee.
Yes. Yes.
Sorry,
Yes.
It's a bit of a theme for me at the moment because I haven't had any in the last 2 days. No, I don't mean I haven't had any decent coffee. I haven't had any coffee. So when we're talking about enhancing progress and what are the key impediments, we're kind of doing that as we go. But when you look at some of what came out of yesterday's discussion, we had Ian Pointer talking about marine diversity, its state of health and the threats to it. We heard Bill Lawrence talking about the link between roads and essentially destruction of native habitat, destruction of biodiversity, and of various other things. And what was obvious from both, of course, is once again how governments, how authorities take that into account when they are planning for growth. And you've got, the dilemmas are there in the most advanced societies, the dilemmas are in the most developed societies, the dilemmas are there writ large for developing societies. And right here, you've got this kind of constant friction between the health of the reef, the health of tropical rainforests and development. What Bill Lawrence was talking about was profound, really, in the picture that he painted. So in terms of enhancing progress and key impediments, that's right at the heart of it, it would seem to me. But beyond Komla's point about it comes down to leadership, it also comes down, doesn't it, to the power of the people in the field to make their case and to find the forums to do it. But that's it's almost motherhood stuff, isn't it?
I mean, what I find as an individual who's an academic but also a practitioner, as an architect, and having also come from a development construction background previously, I worked for a Japanese developer contractor called Kojima, who are all about modular construction and getting things built. I can see that we as architects, and I can say this because I am one, that we love doing pretty pictures, and we, so look at that. Don't you like it? What do you mean you don't like it? I'm an architect. I've studied for 7 years. Don't you know who I am? Is that real sort of, it can get into these very, very subjective arguments as to how you are coming up with a design that is basically a yes or no answer. You go to a doctor, you're feeling sick, there is this sense of diagnosis, and then they'll give you the prescription, and you're going to get better. But with design, it could be very much one man's meat is another man's poison. I think one of the big stances that I think we as a profession should be taking is to get more into evidence-based design, whereby we can substantiate our designs more environmentally responsibly. So we should be able to design something, and we should be able to test it. We should be testing those solutions based on the climatic conditions, the social demographic, and provide these responses and inform the clients accordingly. And then it's a two-way approach. You've got then the private sector that's going to be listening to informed evidence-based solutions, and then the public sector that are able to, from the legislative point of view, provide green policy to ensure that collectively, from private and public, and individuals in the field, that we are creating a more green urban habitat.
I mean, this is the age of communications, the age of the internet, the age of the computer. You might assume, but I suspect often falsely, that therefore there is enormous communication amongst scientists, amongst architects, and between disciplines, and between those disciplines and governments and policymakers. I mean, we talk about governments, but the policymakers are an incredibly important part of that. But one of the things that struck me with the report was the finding that research and development spending in and relation to the tropics accounts for only 10% of world R&D. I would have thought there were huge ramifications for that.
I think it's
Jason?
a question, though, of standards of living again. I mean, standards of living.
Right.
It's not until economies like Singapore and Australia that are wealthy enough to have large research and development centres that these things can take place. You know, in much of the tropics, the economies are still less developed or in the early phases of development, so things like R&D are just not even on the agenda. But I think over time, as you start to get more of these countries coming up to middle-income powers, and you start to see some maybe centres of excellence in India and Brazil and places like that, and China's becoming an innovative country as well, as we've seen, that perhaps the East Asian success will start to sort of show through to the tropics. But again, only when those countries get their standard of living higher than it is now.
There was a question posed that are we likely to see greater threats from tropical diseases in the rest of the world as the tropic zone expands due to global warming? Well, it's not just global warming. I mean, we've got the Ebola virus drama unfolding in Africa at the moment, and from what I read about that, the world has almost ignored it. There has been a response, but nothing like the response that is required according to the handful of people, when it really gets down to it, who are dealing with it, and that is potentially a threat to the entire world.
Again, though, I think until this sort of thing starts to affect the developed world, people's attitudes...
Well, there's an implication in it that it doesn't matter if it's contained.
Well, but also, getting back to your R&D point, the drugs to treat Ebola effectively are available in the advanced countries, and if I came down with Ebola today,
you'd be okay.
I could be treated.
Oh, that's all right then.
So, but what I'm saying is that the Ebola virus is able to do what it's doing because a lack of availability of expensive treatments, which are protected by global patents and developed elsewhere.
Yeah.
So this is...
But even from a point of view of developed world, complete self-interest, they should be in there, killing it off as quickly as they can.
We saw in the case of SARS in Hong Kong,
yes,
a very rapid response when you start to see a developed nation with wealthy people where there is access to health resources and a strong rule of law, where policy makers, governments, health professionals got together and took quick action and were able to resolve a situation. I think if Ebola gets outside the region, you might start to see a different response. But at the moment, you're not going to.
It's also a question of institutional capability in the countries themselves, which is a fundamental issue. It cuts through corruption. You've also mentioned how many graduates are in certain areas of certain countries. And this comes back to the interaction between development and the environment. You can transplant exactly the same legal framework from, say, Australia in the terms of biodiversity offsets we require of a mining company that wants to go into the Galilee Basin, and you can take that straight to Ghana. How will it actually be executed on the ground? Is the bureaucracy competent to actually really go through an environmental impact statement and assess it correctly? How many people there have postgraduate degrees to actually, argue with the consultants who put this report together? There's enormous institutional capability gaps between certain areas of the tropics and world's best practice. And So it's not as simple as just transplanting the institutions. There is a need to build a whole generation of well-educated people with the competency to put all of that in place. And finally on this point, and bringing it back to corruption, because this relates to the legal framework as well, and the interaction with the environment and development, a lot of tropical countries do put a lot of power in terms of the executive, if you will, to just ride roughshod over what their bureaucracy tells them to do. So you do get favoured projects getting up that wouldn't get up, I think, in a situation when there are more checks and balances and independent advisory groups and the like.
And we talk about population growth, we talk about the growth of economies and so on. What we haven't really addressed either is another huge issue, of course, is the whole issue of a sustainable population and how much the globe can take. But there would be tropical. There is an argument been going on for years in Australia about what is a sustainable population for Australia, which is put by some experts as low as 6 million people. So that's another kind of huge aspect of the whole thing. But I must say, I've been deeply impressed by the self-discipline of one of our co-hosts, Sandra Harding, because as a key driving force for the whole State of the Tropics report, I think she's been extraordinarily self-disciplined in not asking a question or making a point yet, but I'm very pleased to see you at the microphone, Sandra.
Thank you. Look, I'm really excited by the conversation that's happening here, and I'll tell you why. We can readily explain, and I think many of the panel members have just gone to this, about why it is we're not paying sufficient attention. Now, can I say that is in fact the driving force behind this report? The very point of this was to help us understand that geopolitically there is this band of the world. It will have, as it does now, the weight of the world's children. It'll have the weight of the world's population, the weight of the world's biodiversity. So the challenge for us is not to simply passively explain why things don't happen. It is to say that if in the future to come, where all these people are going to be, where all this development is demanded, if we don't think that we, I guess, must intervene, or at least in terms of our own thinking, about how it is we're going to ensure that there is the appropriate health infrastructure there, how there is going to be the appropriate educational infrastructure there and the economic infrastructure there, then the world as it exists right now, I think, or certainly then, will be a much poorer place, because we'll have, even in sharper delineation, the rest and the tropics, and we'll be able to sort of stand back, perhaps hermetically sealed from what's going on in the tropical world, and understand, I think the tragedy that will play out there. So the very point of this report was geopolitical in no small sense. I mean, it was really to highlight these issues, to understand that these are issues that we can no longer ignore, to point out the history, the colonial history of this. And I love it from an Australian point of view. Both of our treasurers yesterday talked about the Australian Institute of Tropical Health and Medicine, which received funding, 42 million from the state government, 42 million from the federal government. Very, very grateful for that. Now, that funding came 100 years after the establishment of Australia's first research institute of any stripe, the Australian Institute of Tropical Medicine. It was established in 1910, and it was one of a set of institutes set up around the world to look at, it was part of the colonisation project. How do white people live in the tropics? We better understand this. So most of the old colonial powers set these up in their old colonies in order to help solve that problem. It was a military essential. Anyway, in Australia, when this was established, if you look at Hansard, the parliamentarians that were discussing at the time, the person who was introducing this notion of Australia's very first research institute of any type, said that the aim of the institute is to determine whether civilised man can live in the tropics without succumbing to moral degeneracy.
And the answer is no.
Well, every now and then people do ask me that, and I say around orientation week I sort of wonder, at the university, but no, we've moved on. But the point is, we're locked in this mindset of north-south, east-west, developing, Asia the rest. And the notion is to understand what is happening in that lateral zone of the world, that expanding lateral zone of the world, expose that to our own intelligentsia, understand that the R&D, it's absolutely understandable why R&D is being neglected, and neglected tropical diseases are neglected, and the funding doesn't go to them, but they are going to touch the rest of the world now too, and we've got to think about how is it we drive that without waiting for this to organically occur as a result of what's going to happen in those countries. My last point is, and certainly Graham Hugo mentioned this, Hugh mentioned this again today, but that demographic dividend, I mentioned it in my opening remarks too, the demographic dividend that will exist in that lateral zone of the world where there's a common climate, where there's a common environmental conditions as well. That's where the world's labour force is going to be. That's where the world's people are going to be. We need, I think, for security reasons as well as economic reasons, as well as, I think, moral reasons to ensure that those populations can grow up and thrive, because we will need them too, those of us who don't live in the tropics. We will need them too. Thank you.
Now, while you've got the microphone, Sandra, one last point. So as you were sitting there yesterday, and let's say you had a glass half full in front of you, what thoughts were going through your mind as you were hearing Bill Lawrence talking, not the whole broad thing about roads, but where he talked specifically about Brazil? I mean, that was such a profound problem that he was raising. And I know that this is part of a debate that's been going on in the world for a very long time. What were the thoughts running through your mind in the context of what you're trying to achieve? As you heard a problem that profound.
I have the benefit of Bill's advice, and of course he's a professor here at our university. In addition, when the report was launched, he was one of the 4 people on the stage who was part of the expert panel. And I think for me, and Brazil itself, it's good for people in the room to know, being part of the G20, are absolutely enlivened by this. And we've had media as recently as just last week from Brazil on this. And one of our partners is the Institute, their National Institute for Research on the Amazon. So they're really trying to grapple with this. And what you have is you have just a series of really hard choices, don't you? I mean, Bill said at one level, some of these areas you should not put roads through, and yet we know there are going to be economic and development imperatives linked to that. On the other hand, if you're taking the long view, and I love Hugh challenging us to say we've just got to be thinking further out than we are right now. If you take the long view, how is it that you try to minimise the worst effects, but understanding that perhaps that development has to happen, and has to happen in a controlled way. In the same way, I mean, I'm just seriously interested to hear from Jason Pomeroy. If it's true, and we know it's 45% of the tropics are in cities now, and we know that urbanisation is increasing at a faster rate, we know the weight of the world's population will be in the tropics by the 2030s actually, and all those children by 2050. How long ahead, and Hugh, you mentioned this too about the development in Brazil, how far ahead do we have to begin to plan for that urbanisation? What's our prospect of having any sort of control over this at all? And what do we need to do in order to achieve that? So in a way, I'm sort of taking your question. I'm sending it off to Jason.
Well done.
We're looking at sort of timeframes of anything between 20 and 30 years. And what's quite curious, for instance, the Abu Dhabi Vision Plan was a 30-year plan. I did a master plan, with a regional planning exercise for Malaysia, Vision Valley. That was 80,000 acres, which is it was quite big, and that was actually a 30-year vision plan. And I think that it's important that we do think very carefully about infrastructure and what Bill was saying yesterday, because with that population increase, we are running the risk of what we call accessibility suffocation. If I'm not mistaken, there was an academic from Australia, academic in Australia called Ernest Sixner, who was actually doing a lot of research into particular grids of cities, and actually did a wonderful study on Brisbane, Melbourne, and various, I think it was 4 Australian cities and 4 American cities, and looked at the grid formations from colonial times and how they've actually adapted with time. When we look at Portland, for instance, the 60-metre by 60-metre grid of streets, it's a wonderful walkable environment, a wonderful walkable city. You walk 60 metres, you can turn left or right. There are particular grids that we can experience that are a bit too long. You start getting a bit bored, and you're just waiting to turn the corner left or right. So what we need to ensure is that we have a really good understanding of the grid, because these are wonderful means of actually encouraging walkability. And when we look at the tighter grains of cities like Portland, you can see that in the 19th century, these were nothing more than residential communities, terraced houses, but today they've become point blocks. They've been able to adapt, and they've been able to adapt because of the effectiveness of the grid. And so I think when we're planning over the 20 or 30-year period in these developing environments, we should be very conscious about trying to ensure that the mobility is not just about us jumping in a car, but it's also about us being able to walk effectively and ensuring that those spaces are shaded and sheltered with greenery and are providing an ease of movement for people on a bike or even in an electric bus. I mean, you look at Curitiba, one of the most sustainable cities in the world, has a wonderful bus network. So I think the challenge for the 21st century city is a green city of mobility, and to avoid that accessibility suffocation whereby you just don't have the infrastructure in place. And we start to see that heavily in congested cities like Manila. We see that extensively in Mumbai. And it's because that it's grown so much, there's been so much inner city migration, and we've just forgotten about that infrastructure on the ground.
When we talk about all these things, Komla, so much of Africa comes out as the poor relation. Does it have to be ever thus?
Look, I think Graham Hugo's comment yesterday that once upon a time, population planning was an integral part of development. But somewhere along the line, it fell. So these days people talk about capacity building and other things, but we are really talking about population planning. For me, when I say history, when you look at the history, and a critical part of this history is the Industrial Revolution from the UK, the way the Industrial Revolution spread industrial technology from the UK to Northern Europe, and then later on to Russia, Southern Europe on the one hand, across the Atlantic to the Americas on the other hand. By the mid-19th century, railway technology, for instance, at that time was being saturated in those countries, and then it moved to India, Malaysia, other areas. Africa, not until the last decade of the 19th century that the first railway lines were laid, apart from South Africa. I guess what I'm trying to say is that if we understand the way industrial capital and commercial capital has been moving globally, Africa's time is always going to come. And when we think about the 2/3 of young people that are going to be living in the tropics, we can either look at that as a liability internationally, or we look at it as an asset. And for me, as I said, my ears are on the ground, the level at which I worked, trying to understand how families, what decisions are people making to make life better for themselves. Whether we like it or not, people are going to be searching for a better future. And I know this word hasn't come up the last 2 days, but migration, refugees, migration into places like Australia. So we have a choice, as Graham Hugo says, wherever we are, whether in villages in Africa, governments in Africa, or North Queensland, if we are planning development, we need to be planning for population. Some of this population may come from elsewhere. Some may be locally grown. And we need to make, absolutely the point was made yesterday about how to utilize our indigenous human resources, human capital locally, in terms of some of the planning we had this morning. What are the strategies to actually utilize local labor force? But some of this labor may also come from internationally, and hence having the understanding that whatever happens in the tropics are in relationship with the rest of the world. Africans are migrating in huge numbers, getting drowned in the ocean. They are flocking to Southern Europe to make, in search of better life. I sit with people in villages, and when I talk about development, they say, look, we've always looked for a better life. Even nomadic societies, we always moved in search of better life. And international migration is nothing different from what we've always done. So I guess the point I'm trying to make is whatever happens in the tropics, it affects us wherever we are. Whether it's Ebola, whether, yes, we have the health facilities here. But, these things can sneak in at any time. Yes, and unless, and here too, I should also make the point that I'm not necessarily saying aid, charity from the developed countries is going to be the solution. If you look at foreign direct investment, that has been the critical factor in whatever changes happening in Africa now. The Chinese investment, no matter what views people may have, I think looking at this, 2/3 of the population as an asset and as business, potential investors, how do we invest in the education of these populations to create the labor force? How do we ensure that some of those people live in villages that they want to be, live sustainable living? How do we also ensure that the mega projects we heard about this morning are also strategically located at places that are not going to take account of what Bill was talking about yesterday? I mean, the project we heard about this morning, it's interesting that's being located on existing cattle stations. So this is land being utilized already. At the same time, some of this excess population will make it to the non-tropical world, and we've got to plan for it rather than the chaotic system we have at the moment.
Okay. Any other comment from the panel on what we've talked about so far, because I want to come to the audience? No? Okay. Questions from the audience, and I'll be very pleased to be flooded. That looks very healthy to me. We'll start over here. Just endeavour to keep the questions reasonably to the point.
Sheridan Morris from RRC. We haven't heard anything about our actual nearest neighbour, particularly to where we are now, PNG. If we're looking at massive development and massive resource development around LNG and copper and extractive industries, yet we fundamentally have a failing society. Corruption is a major driver, and we've seen, also through Oceania, we've seen just individual circumstances at the village level, at the community level, actually going backwards, not forwards. This doesn't fall into any of the discussions I've sort of heard yet in the last few days. So I was wondering if we could have some feedback on that.
Okay. Would anyone like to comment?
Maybe it's a case of a country too small to matter.
You might have to adjust your microphone, Jason.
Sorry.
Just bring it up a little bit higher, mate. Yep.
I said maybe it's a case of a country too small to matter. Indonesia, with 250 million people, is a geopolitically important nation on our doorstep. It's important economically, so we care what happens there. And I guess throughout much of Oceania, you've got very small nations that really we don't care much about. So it's, I guess, what you're saying is it's a policy failing, and yes, you're right. And I think the reason for that is because these places are rather small, so no one really cares too much.
Just following on from that, and Komla's earlier remarks about sort of path dependence and colonialisation. One of the reasons why colonised countries have failed is that they were originally developed on the basis of something which is antiquated now, but it's called staple theory, where they basically have one pillar export or one pillar product which sustains a certain jurisdiction, and it's basically exported to the core of the world economy. There's never any higher aspiration for that situation. It's a plantation economy, or a sheep economy, or it's a coal economy. In the special case of that is the energy-rich jurisdiction. And if you are energy-rich, particularly in terms of liquid fuels, you're wealthy. And PNG really, up until the most recent exploitation and the mega project up there, which Chevron is running, has been plagued by the limitations of staple theory, but now it's actually going to get rich in numerical terms. The thought that that will filter down very effectively to the bulk of the population, well, it's just not set up really for the local population to benefit from that. So it's a very narrow economic base on the one hand, and it's very tightly held resources, incredibly unequal income distribution. And that's my interpretation of the PNG situation.
Question? Yes. Wait for the microphone if you would. That doesn't give you the perfect answer to what you're looking for, and part of it obviously relates to the extraordinarily difficult nature of actually running a country like New Guinea, which is so disparate in its own population makeup and in the terrain of the country. And you can argue about whether Australia is doing enough in its obligations to a poor neighbour which it once colonised. But that's as far as we're going on this panel. Sorry.
I think in response, rather than a question, I think some of the issues with places like PNG and other developing countries is that the cultural and legal institutions that are in place. To give you an analogy, in Australia we've got farmers, they're asset-rich, cash-poor. So they can go and access capital by going to the banks, for instance, and they provide their farms as security. In other countries that are developing where those assets are community-held, where you don't have freehold, for instance, that becomes a different ballgame because they have got a lot of assets. But those assets are not readily available to the Western-type society and institutions which would lend them money, because you'd basically be lending it to the community where you don't have any access to the security. And so I think there needs to be some change with regard to the view of institutions, and perhaps some legal change to enhance the capability and the freeing up of that capital.
Anyone want to comment on that? Tom?
Yeah. Look, I've had, or I still have, a little to do with Papua New Guinea. And obviously there are lots of similarities between Papua New Guinea and West Africa. And I think we should also remember that Papua New Guinea has only been independent for how many years? Since 1974. For a fairly short period. It's a fairly short period. And the fact that despite all the chaos, I tell my colleagues in Papua New Guinea, despite all the chaos, that they've managed to change governments peacefully without resort to armed conflict.
They tried.
I think it's an incredible achievement. So for me, when I observe these societies, despite all the chaos, I'm looking at where are the alternative stories? What is happening? What is working for this society? And when you look carefully, there's a lot happening. And I touched on the issue of the relationship between rural areas and urban areas. And I've just got a new PhD student who just arrived from Papua New Guinea 2 months ago. And I share with him some of the experience in West Africa in terms of people who migrate to the cities, how rural areas can use them as resources. And his eyes just open because, and people are doing it, people who are in camps. People who are in camps are supporting their rural communities So there may be government failures and others, but civil society, if we observe carefully, despite all the chaos, what are ordinary people doing to improve their own situation? And if those ordinary people can talk to each other, and that's how social change, one aspect of social change. Yeah, so I have a lot of confidence that change will come.
We got anyone from over this side? No? Okay. Come to the... over here. Oh, we've got a mic on this side. Yep, there you go.
Mark Zambicki stayed at the Tropics Project in James Cook University. Of all the OECD countries, Australia is last, if not almost last, on collaboration between industry and higher education sector. Why are we so poorly positioned? What can we do about it? And what are some of the lessons maybe from places such as Singapore?
I don't know.
How refreshing.
But interesting, collaboration between industry and education. I mean, is that...
Sorry, you got the microphone there.
Sorry, say that again.
The public sector research organisations, so I'm thinking primarily, I guess, the higher education sector, industries such as CSIRO, for example, and industry. There's very little collaboration. We're ranked, I think, last out of 34 countries or 33rd. I don't know why that is. And perhaps, maybe we should ask someone from Australia about that. But
well, I mean, there are some very interesting case studies in Europe about sort of the collaborative process. I mean, Cambridge University runs... I mean, in the built environment, I can speak about the built environment. The Cambridge University has a course called Interdisciplinary Design for the Built Environment that actually is kind of a funded project by a very, very sort of prestigious engineering company with Cambridge University to try and foster a greater collaboration between industry professionals and academia. So what this does, it basically creates a platform for senior management, 8 years experience and above from industry, wanting to top up their skills to be able to take on a leadership role in climate change positions or green developments. And the idea is that they have a thesis project, and it's a 2-year professional master's course. And this model has then been replicated in the London School of Economics, the Cities programme. Again, a collaboration between another engineering institution plus a university. And again, it's fostering a professional in industry being able to top up their skills academically and then straddle between their profession and academia. When we look into Asia, I think that there is still this sort of burgeoning market, and I think that NUS, Singapore University of Technology and Design, there's certainly 2 institutions that are going through these more collaborative projects now. There is also the Building Construction Authority of Singapore, which is public sector. They basically control the built environment in terms of building legislation, health and safety, so on and so forth. And they partnered with Nottingham University. Again, it's that master's level course at 8 years experience and above, attracting people from local councils, attracting engineers, attracting architects to come in and, again, top up their skills. So I think that increasingly the whole concept of those who can do, those who can't teach is being kind of broken down. I think that education is moving in a direction that is allowing the individual to be a player, a professional in industry, and by embracing a particular specialist field of research and getting that qualification, are then becoming the thought leaders in the greener built environment industry.
Hugh, did you want to add something to that?
Sure. I think there's very deep historical reasons for this. Once you get away from the very, very obvious things like scale and money, Australia had a manufacturing sector operating behind tariff walls for a great deal of our history. Who came and set up behind the tariff walls? International companies. And where do the international companies do their R&D, and where do they collaborate with universities? At home. And so the fact that we really imported our manufacturing sector, where a great deal of this interaction happens, essentially set us on a particular path, and we're still dependent on that path to a degree. Now that's the manufacturing sector. We have health, we have a number of other areas where Australia actually does do quite well in certain niches, and tropical medicine is one of those areas, and JCU is right at the forefront of this. But if you look at the Australian corporate sector, who are our national champion companies who might have a really lucrative university linkage? Well, they're big resources companies. We have big banks who aren't, big R&D hubs, if you like. We have the odd company like a CSL, but then we have a Westfield. If you actually look at the structure of our economy and you see where certain parts of our economic makeup have got their technology from historically, they go to the best in the world, and the fact of the matter is the best universities in the world are in temperate zones. They're in the Ivy League, they're Oxbridge, and that's where the multinationals who really drive the global economy go for their collaborations. Yeah, and actually on this final point, when Peter Costello launched his higher education fund many years ago, he seeded it with $5 billion, which at the time was about 1/6 of Harvard's endowment, singly. The relative scale that the world's real top tier of universities can bring is just in a different stratosphere to the Australian system.
It just reminded me of one thing. There is another issue about those sort of collaborations. So there have been cases of, say, you do a Doctor of Engineering, and there has been a particular institution that is in collaboration with an engineering institution in collaboration with a university institution. And you get a student coming in, suddenly getting one fantastic bright spark of an idea, and they're pursuing the PhD or the Doctor of Engineering. And then all of a sudden, the engineering company that they're actually being sponsoring the student suddenly thinks, maybe we shouldn't be actually releasing this. Maybe it's something that we want to hold on to. And I think that's one of the barriers to the change in seeing these kind of professional doctorates or professional master's courses that have this sort of linkage between industry and academia. Sometimes it's the industry part that thinks this information is too good. This is something that we can actually be using ourselves in private practice. So it can also be a bit of a stumbling block, and that's something that we're. Yeah, but if it's an interesting one. I'd be more than happy to chat more about that afterwards.
Sorry, just very quickly. Yeah.
The other aspect of this is sort of since Whitlam, we've actually been removing those tariff walls, and we've really gone away from thinking of ourselves as a manufacturing country. Whereas industry policy is still incredibly fashionable in some countries. And when you actually have the leadership setting industry policy up, or you have a very commercial university sector in the first instance, such as the rise of engineering schools in the United States and the institutes of technology which they set up, you end up with quite an uncommercial academic sector in many instances.
Of course, it'd be rather sad and more than a little worrying if we ended up with absolutely no manufacturing industry in this country, and we're sort of 90% service sector. And I remember a period when the Hawke and Keating governments pretty much completed the dismantling of the tariff wall. What was also in train there was the development of an elaborately transformed manufacture sector, which was doing a lot of exporting. I've lost track of what's happened since, but I suspect a lot of that has kind of moved backwards, which ended up being a very large gap for Australia. Now, Komla, I know you wanted to say something briefly, and then I'll come to Jason, and then next question.
Yeah, just quickly to make the point that in Australia, I think it's called work integrated learning, which is going to be, a big part of future of education. But the area I want to comment on, which I know best, is the Cooperative Research Centre, the scheme, Cooperative Research Centre scheme, which the Australian government set up deliberately to bring industry and research together. And that's currently being reviewed, and we don't know the future, what's going to happen. But also to make the point that some of those processes are just too expensive to plan, to actually plan a successful cooperative research center application. It takes about 6 months to 1 year investment across a range of partners. And I think if we really want to encourage industry and research collaboration, then the mechanisms need to be made much more cost effective. Yeah.
Jason, were you going to say something?
I just wanted to pick up on your point about manufacturing, and just to say that in the 1960s, manufacturing was 40% of Australia's economy. Now it's less than 10%. Yet during that time, our standard of living has increased 3 times over. So we shouldn't be afraid about the demise of manufacturing. We may continue to have some elaborate transformed manufacturing. We may continue to have some products like building materials that are too expensive to ship, but the reality is we'll have a very small manufacturing base going forward, and we shouldn't be afraid of that. And so perhaps when we talk about collaboration between industry and government, it should be not in the manufacturing type areas, but more in the services sector.
Okay, question.
One of the cardinal rules of running a successful conference is never give the mic to someone that comes from far away with an agenda. So I came 5,000 miles and I have an agenda, so sorry.
You've got 1 minute.
30 seconds. I've thoroughly enjoyed all of this discussion, and I think there's something that undercurrents all of your discussions. And Dr. Pomeroy, I love your idea of the green mobility. I think it's fabulous. There's something that I think needs to be brought into the discussion, and that's the issue of resilience. Resilience, particularly from disaster, but also resilience from any adverse event. And I think it's been touched upon, but I'd like to hear your collective views on that, given what we've heard today.
On resilience?
Resilience.
There's a challenge.
Well, resilience, it's a very, very broad concept. One way you can think of it is, the resilience of supply chains. If you think about what happened in Japan very recently, and the way companies all over the world started to scramble as their supply chains were interrupted. Production has become so fragmented now with globalisation, and the number of individual components that go into an automobile and where they come from is just staggering now. That has actually made the economy, it's more diversified, so arguably it's more resilient, but there is always going to be that one vital cog, which you can't do without, that is subject to adverse events. I don't think we can run our lives, though, wondering when the next adverse event is coming. People continue to live in San Francisco, and you're only one season away from another cyclone here. I think you do what you can in the built environment to be resilient, and we're very good at building for earthquakes now. We know where not to build nuclear plants now.
Do we?
I don't know if we've really solved the supply chain story, because the shareholder does not like inbuilt redundancy, which is what true resilience is about, which is having a backup plan for everything and having a backup plan for the backup plan. And that's very expensive. It's dilutive of margin, and that's the last thing that professional investors are happy with. And so CEOs won't do it.
Komla. Just to touch on 2 aspects of resiliency. I think I kept on making the point that my interest has been understanding how ordinary people cope with day-to-day challenges of life. There's a lot of research evidence here that, and in fact, again, a related thing we haven't touched on in the last 2 days is some of the huge lifestyle health challenges, obesity, diabetics, huge challenges. I mean, the resiliency for me at the individual level or family level is about how people cope with everyday life, adversity, without this becoming overwhelming for them. A social demographer, Len Syme, he put it this way, that when you get up out of bed in the morning and you think about the day's challenges ahead of you, and then your shoulders slump, you say, no, this is hard. If that happens continuously, that chronic, debilitating feeling of, no, I can't, these things are not working, is the accumulation of this which actually creates a whole lot of health problems for us. And but if you get out of bed in the morning and then you look ahead and you say, well, it's going to be a big day, it's full of challenges, yes, but I know how to manage. I know where to draw on resources to manage. So that's one aspect of resiliency. And when you work at community levels, you see a lot of that, and that gives you encouragement, hope. But the other aspect of resiliency, and this Ebola case has raised this whole discussion. The Lancet carried a series of discussions just this week, that we need to think in terms of resiliency of systems resiliency. Even, if poor tropical countries with very poor health services, if they don't have the excess capacity, they can't even meet the current demand, let alone excess capacity. So there's this idea that in terms of resiliency, health systems such as Australia need to be planning, inbuilt resiliency, which excess capacity that they can draw on to support in emergency situations. So, yeah.
Okay, next question. We have the gentleman at the back and then the lady in the front. Are you a gentleman?
I'll try to be. Jason Pomeroy, yesterday you touched on outcomes, one being produced with the stick and the other with the carrot, which I thought was interesting. Now, the European model tends to be the stick, which is increased regulation, which is very much what's been adopted in Australia. Now, regulation crushes creativity, it crushes enthusiasm, and it stifles investment. It seems to me that to create a really dynamic, vigorous approach to building up tropical countries in the tropical zone is to have systems which incentivize individuals to get the desired outcomes. Would the panel like to comment on that?
That's a great question. I mean, I think that when we look at Singapore legislation, there are mechanisms in the built environment that allows you to build more area with the incorporation of sky-rise greenery, sky courts and sky gardens. And that is the carrot. Whereas in the UK, all new homes will be carbon zero by 2016. That is the stick. And I think that, the ability to try and find the middle ground is going to be key. Now, what you find in Singapore, high-density urban environment, is that you are almost deliberately having to maximize your gross built-up area because the land values are just astronomical. You're going to have to really, really push your building design hard. That part, the economic side, can actually stifle the creativity. That could lend itself, if not careful, to this cookie-cutter approach of having same old condominium towers that just spring up everywhere. And with the increasing urbanization and population coming into Singapore, you're just going to see those towers getting taller and taller and taller. So I think the government are kind of familiar with that. And so incorporating those pockets of greenery, looking at night lighting, which is also helping to take reduce the street lighting because of the lighting from the buildings, looking at the incorporation of renewable energy sources, looking at green wall incorporation. All of these have sort of the incentive schemes. You can actually be building more area, and there will actually be government support in applying some of these different technologies or ideas, which I think is hugely encouraging. And what this does, it actually then breaks up the cookie-cutter approach. You don't necessarily see today the same replicated tower of plates stacked one above the other. You are starting to see a bit more diversity in the cityscape. And I think it's encouraging because then the overlaying of that element about resilience is that these mechanisms that the government are sort of pushing through, they are also helping with the climatic resilience issue. They are already writing in code that you should be putting these pockets of green space on the east and west side of the building, which is obviously where there's a lot of heat gain during the rising sun and the setting sun, putting them on the rooftops, because if you've got a bare concrete roof, it's just going to be absorbing all of that heat and it's going to get sort of super hot. Ensuring that you've got the rainwater runoff into these pocket gardens so that it's naturally irrigating the planting. Dare I say it? This is not rocket science. I mean, this is what we've been doing for centuries before technology. You've got the Queenslander house here, big lofty spaces with wonderful verandas, pitched roofs. The Kampong house in Malaysia, naturally ventilated spaces raised up on stilts to stop creepy crawlies coming in. What we find is that these ideas are finding its reinterpretation in the modern legislation and cropping up in these buildings now.
Okay, we're going to take this next question. Will have to be the last. Yep.
It's a quick question.
There's no pressure on you, but it's got to be a good one.
So, Alex Edelman, Health and Medicine, JCU. Quick question for Hugh. So I know you deliberately chose a subset of countries and regions on your analysis modelling scenarios. Just wondered where Africa, in particular Nigeria, fits into that, given the demographic dividend issue.
Okay, well, Nigeria very specifically, it's not a country I know a great deal about, besides probably what everyone in my profession knows about being oil rich and being wealthy by African standards, but having a huge impoverished working class. How does sub-Saharan Africa feature? It features principally through what I say about South Africa in the projections. South Africa, of course, is the S when people pluralise brick and make it bricks. And what I do when I put the scenarios together is I use some subjective judgment to overlay on the demographics to actually make a judgment about how reasonable it is for those countries to grow based upon any number of factors, economic and otherwise. So sub-Saharan Africa and South Africa are doing okay, but they are certainly dwarfed despite the demographic dividend because you have to find jobs for these people. This is the issue with saying that demographics is destiny. It absolutely is not. Physically having people in a country provides demand of a sort, but it doesn't provide growth unless you are able to have those individuals actually improve their own productivity in their work and drive the economy forward. That is why countries that have had the Christmas tree demographics over a long period of time and have not developed, that's their problem. And the Philippines, which I mentioned as something that we should be thinking harder about, the Philippines was actually held up as the next big thing in 1960, at the same time that the multilateral agencies were saying South Korea's got no chance, they've got horrible demographics. So that's why I very, very specifically said that demographics is not destiny where living standards are concerned. And that's why you can have failed urbanisation. People can move from rural areas to the urban areas, but if there is no job when they arrive, that's failed urbanisation. There has to be an economic reason for the rural to urban migration, and in many African countries that is not the case. And I've never been to Lagos, but I assume that there is an enormous slum area of Lagos, as there is in most African cities. Yes. And you're an expert on West Africa, so I should probably kick the question to you now. Just very quickly, Komla.
Yeah. Look, I touched on the point already that the huge potential is there. And if the recent trends in terms of FDI, foreign direct investment, is anything to go by, and if that continues, then some of the jobs will be created internally there. But I also made the point that investing in education is critical because some of that labor will end up in Europe, in Australia, other places, either as skilled laborers or unskilled people. And whichever way, it concerns Australia and Europe. And we've got to plan for it in our planning, yes.
Okay. That's where our time runs out. But I must say it's been a fantastic discussion. And I want to thank all four of you for making a big contribution to the success of the overall conference. So thank you all very much. Now, Komla, you're the only one who hasn't had one of these. That's a special thanks to you.